We're back, motherfuckers.
What's up, cocksuckers?
Suck a dick, listeners.
Oh yeah. So we're trying. We told you we're trying a new approach. Look,
Coming out hot today.
We're sorry. We're sorry. We had to get your
One of
attention.
us is sorry.
I didn't think. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I speak for the state of Jordan. Okay, before, dude. Look, we've had a long day, so we'll just leave it at that. Welcome back. Yes, we got part of that right. I like where this episode went.
Yeah,
I'm just going to say that. I like where it went.
And it ended somewhere else.
It ended somewhere else. It's a journey. We take you on a journey, and it's how our minds work. So like, we on the podcast a few weeks ago, we hinted at some changes happening in the podcast world. Probably coming in October now, we're going to see some cool stuff happening with the channel. Slightly different format. And one of the things that we decided that we were going to do is really get back to the old episode style. And when I started to realize at a point, because I don't think people realize how few people listened at the start, like any podcast, I suppose, but we get 17 downloads on episodes. Like for early days, like there, and you were double digit Instagram following. I may have been, soon on your heels, but like nobody listened. But we get people who did listen early or have gone back who like, man, I really fucked with the style. And the style was like, look, we're going to talk shit for like 20 minutes about whatever we're thinking about. And then we're going to get into like actually some really surprisingly high level ways of thinking about resistance training. And I remember getting feedback from, someone at a gym somewhere. And I remember like, it was like 2 weeks in a row, 2 different gyms, 2 different people. And someone came up, he's like, oh, RX radio. I was like, yo, this is wild. So like, what? And I was like, yeah, dude, like, thanks for listening. That's so cool. And he's like, man, I got to be honest. Like, I really just listened to the first 20 minutes. I think you guys are fucking hilarious. Once you start talking about resistance training, I kind of just like, well, I listened for a little bit and I got some stuff from it, but like, I just think you guys are dope. And I was like, oh, dude, that's fucking awesome. The next weekend, different gym, someone walks out to me like, oh, RX radio. I was like, yo, get the fuck out of here, dog. We made it. And they're like, look, I don't care for the first 20 minutes of all your shows. I'm going to be honest. I kind of skip right to when I hear your tone change about exercise, but like, I got to say, lights out. So we're back on that clearly by the introduction. Yeah. So today I don't know, like I like talking because it's thinking, it's not thinking out loud. To me, talking is thinking. It's the action of thinking, right? Like it's thinking in the real world. And it's funny because we talk a lot of shit at the beginning of the episode about people who talk shit on the internet. And it's not actually talking shit on the internet because the internet doesn't exist. It's not the real world. The internet is where people go who don't do things. The real world, like talking shit on the internet, it's not real. If you're to sit there and say, I talk shit, okay, that means you're willing to pay the price. Right? Like anything that you say that you do, I'm going to assume that you do it in the real world. So if you talk shit on the internet, you don't actually talk shit because the action can only occur in the real world because only in the real world do you have consequences. So we got into a PhD level dissertation about punchable faces. Now, some of you probably familiar with the concept, others probably have a punchable face. So we get into, so if you're a part of the group who like the first 20 minutes, great. We go through people trash talking some of my Instagram videos and, we really talk a lot of shit. And I'm going to say that because my goal is to find out where these people live and to talk shit to their face. Because as good as I can do it on the internet, you're not actually talking shit until you do it in real life, like anything. We do a hard transition and we talk about sort of the governing principles of hypertrophy training for the upper body. We did an episode on hypertrophy training for the lower body a couple of weeks ago, to which we're going to go and do kind of an analogous episode that we did today. We talked about the importance And I think we did probably the best job in defining the role of function in hypertrophy that has ever been done on a podcast.
I'm very proud of us. Yeah, we've had a lot of practice. We're probably like deep into the 500s in terms of episodes at this point, but I think we kind of
46.
nailed it. Like probably
Yeah.
560, somewhere around there. I don't know.
Yeah.
Marshall will tell you in the little corner, the upper right hand corner.
Mm.
But yeah, I think we nailed it, and we took a very practical approach to the reason that you need to focus on function in training, defining function in training, and how that's going to govern output in training. Which, whether your goals are strength, hypertrophy, athletic performance, it's an important aspect of training because all of these adaptations lead to one another. So yeah, a really good definition of function in here, and kind of playing into the importance of how that needs to be in your training, no matter what your goals are.
Yeah. If I'm to timestamp this off of memory, around the 30-minute mark, we kind of get into it. Around the 50-minute mark, Jay starts to go in. Around the hour mark, we start to really clarify the definition of function. We talk about the role of warming up, how the importance of warming up is so often misrepresented. We talk about, a moving target of performance milestones and when to know how to transition on from particular methods in training. Like, I think, listen, this entire intro is us just patting ourselves on the back, but like, we do this for a living. And I think we've come up with somewhat of a succinct overview of how to frame concepts that are so often demonized, yet so often deployed. And it's paradoxical. And I think what creates a lot of the paradox and the confusion around some of these concepts, whether or not they work or whether they don't, is understanding them contextually based off the time and the relative skill of a lifter. And I think that performance as a proxy moniker helps carry us through an easy decision-making flow chart or algorithm that is adaptable, and it's adaptable through time, and it's adaptable through someone's performance. So I think if you can and we really are, I'll speak for myself because you do a great job of articulating. I really tried to take the thought in my brain and use my mouth hole to upload that thought into your brain. And I did about as good a job as I think I can do. But what we'll do in the future, we'll talk about lower extremities. We'll talk about some milestone movements, what they actually do. We'll talk about bottlenecks and gatekeepers to hypertrophy, and how the hypertrophy process is really about a reductionist approach to removing those impediments to hypertrophy, rather than looking so sort of detailed and zoomed in the minutia, where actually the answer exists in framing the problem, as you guys heard me say so often. So on that note, PSL1 is up for sale. Class starts September 21st. If you enjoy this episode, first, share it with your friends. Let's get old people out of podcasts. We will not own homes. They do not get to own podcasts. I've been looking now at the charts. I've been perusing the top charts on iTunes and Spotify and the health and fitness. We're also on YouTube as well. If you guys want to see the studio setups, look at the backlighting situation. I got a podium now. I feel like I'm going to run for office. I feel like RFK up here. And start talking about like fake vaccines and shit.
Got my vote, man.
Could you imagine? Yeah, it'd be bedlam. And you guys will see why I'm not fit for political office early on in this episode. So
right away.
Right. So I think it's a very succinct mile marker, but L1 is a lot of the good stuff in this episode. Is like, how do you learn enough principles to start to put them together? So 16-week applied biomechanics, functional anatomy, plus access to the Prescript Collective. Get 24/7 access to talk to the smartest coaches in the world, to troubleshoot, to work out case studies, to talk about clients, to whether it's nutrition or training, sports performance, you name it. We have a subject matter expert in there. So you also get the PSL1 manual. The lectures are taught 4 times a week. So wherever you are in the world, we have 20 plus countries. Shout out Kuwait. And Bahrain showed up this week. So shout out Jabs, Coach Jabs, for just getting all the people in Bahrain excited. Jabs came out with us to level 3. So yeah, a worldwide affair. We're pushing the industry forward. And, I think a lot of people say it, and not a lot of people say it on the internet. Not a lot of people do it in real life. Kind of like talking shit. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the episode. I was very happy with where it landed. Hopefully you guys remember the mental timestamps. And L1 up for sale now, www.pre-script.com. And that's it. Anything to add before we throw to the show?
Yeah, despite me calling you guys cocksuckers like instantly, thanks for being here.
Be
Appreciate you
cool.
guys.
All right. Well, Lundy, hit it.
You're tuned in to RX Radio.
Right. Okay.
I'll throw the nicotine in.
So you were saying before the cameras started rolling, you were talking about punchable faces.
Right, punchable faces. Like there's a type of human on this earth that you see their face and it just makes you angry. Like you don't have to know anything about them. They could like do community service on the weekend and just be the best person, but their face just makes you want to punch them in the mouth as hard as you can. Like that to me is a punchable face. Like most of the faces that I've punched, it's been because of the person behind the face, not just the face.
Really? See, where I come from, those two things kind of run in tandem. And I also come from a place where that's grounds for, that's rules of engagement. Like that's you're justified. Like if you were like your honor,
shit, you can just get punched at any time.
Oh, it's a risk. It's a risk. I've seen it.
I get that.
Yeah, so here's the thing. A punchable face after it's been punched a couple times, it becomes less punchable. Right? Like you get, the classic like top bridge in the nose break a few times. You start walking around with a Matthew McConaughey. People are like, all right, this guy's got a bit of culture. This guy's learned a lesson or two. Or maybe at the very least, he's just already been punched in the face. So like, I think it's a self-correcting. It's, you know what it is? It's justice is what it is. It's the only true justice we have.
I'm learning a lot about myself as you speak, but that's the evolution of my face.
Wait a minute.
People just used to hit me a lot more often, and now like I have a fucked up nose. I got some like cauliflower in the ears. They're like, yeah, it's been done. Like this guy's learned his lesson.
So I think from what I've learned about your history, I feel like you're the person behind the face when it was getting punched may have been a person who deserved it. Let me just say, I don't think you were doing any community service when you were younger.
No.
I mean, maybe at a certain point you almost had to as some sort of court order or something like that.
Yeah.
Picking up trash on the side of the turnpike. Some judge told you to. You got lucky on the judge thing, man.
I know, man. I skirted that one right under the radar.
That's nuts, man. I don't know if anyone's heard that story, but if you're new to the podcast, there's like it was a famous judge in Pennsylvania that was taking money under the table for incarcerating people, children, like kids, like youth, and was getting money from a prison, like some kickback scheme. And this was like a judge in your district.
This is literally, so I got arrested at the time period that this was happening, and I was a minor. So like literally, so I think I've told this story in various capacities on the podcast before. But like, was drinking at a football game, got called out by the cops, was my obnoxious self with a punchable face, which law enforcement, they're not immune to punchable faces. They want to punch me in the face as well. And it's because of the face and the person behind it, the shit talking. But basically, like what happened, I got into an altercation with a police officer that was debatable in terms of them being able to justify it. Like some might say it was excessive force on their side. So basically, it was just one of those things that got swept under the rug, and I never had to go to court for it or never had to see the judge for it. But if it had gone a different way and I did have to go see that judge, like they would have just fucking locked me up and gotten paid for it. It's wild.
Dude, I mean, shout out the boys will be boys cop. Like, because I'd much rather a knee in the middle of my back and like, my face jammed into the fucking cement than doing time in juvie.
Oh, fuck yeah.
Right. So like you kind of like, all right, we're holding court on the street here. So I don't have to fucking get dragged in front of the guy that's going to put me on the fucking row for a bit. So that's man. There's like the Titanic maybe Lion King, and that's like my third favorite story of all time. Like it's just the story has everything. It's fucking incredible. Oh man. Yeah. So Punchable Faces. They're out there. They're a thing.
Yeah.
And I think we just need to embrace it. So then we got on this topic. So we're currently in an L1 registration is open. And part of the marketing campaign, this will probably surprise 0 people who listen to the podcast, probably get targeted crazy with ads, is some of my posts get put up as ads. And I was just commiserating about how annoying it is to deal with the comment section. I think we've done this before, where we've gone into the comment section of people talking shit. And we've just maybe we'll talk a little shit back. And so today's candidate, it's, you know what it is? Like, I don't mind a bit of shit talking. I'll shit talk with the best of them. Like, I got a chip on my shoulder and a big vocabulary. Like, don't fuck with me, dog. Like, I'll hurt you. Then I'll go to work on you. So I did a video about pull-ups and barbell rows, kind of like giving them their flowers. I'm like, you know what? I like pull-ups and barbell rows. They're, in the common... in the town square of weightlifting internet world, they kind of taken some flack and maybe they're ineffective. I'm like, look, there's direct and indirect causes for hypertrophy. And I think a lot of people negate the indirect mechanisms, right? The things that are going to bottleneck you without your know-how, right? Like, and I think, the stability of your shoulder and the stability of your spine are 2 big contributing factors to upper body and really just like whole body hypertrophy, or at least the ability to apply the stimulus necessary without actually being the direct stimulus itself. So I think a massive bottleneck with most people is, they just got like a dog shit spine that can't resist any force, and they just sit on machines and so on and so forth. I could divulge, and maybe we do a whole podcast on that without knowing what exactly the podcast is going to be about today. And so, our fearless leader, Matt, has gone in and clearly pushed this because it has 4,000 likes overnight. So, like, shout out Meta, I guess. But in the comment section, I'm blown away by the time people take. I don't know, dude. I know you and me, and we're busy people. We run our own business. And, we got the podcast, and we got the, pre-script, and we got, another company that we have to form probably the next couple of weeks. And then we have a software company, and, we got commitments, and we got family. And I literally cannot find the time of the day. If I have enough time of the day to like do something on Instagram other than like scroll while I'm on the toilet, it's like to like a couple of photos and maybe repost something that my friends have put up. That's like it. That's all I have. Yeah. But let's read a few from a few of our compatriots here. So we got _Usman.z. Let's see Usman.z. That's a language I don't understand. See translation. I love this. Ooh. So Usman seems 2164. I don't know what that is. He's got like a little emoji of something, and he says, "Thank God." Yeah, this is an interesting one. I'm reminded when I was reminded when I'm and 0 posts, way to contribute. 314 followers, following 308. His name is Usman Zahid. Okay. Zahid. I'm trying to figure out what this emoji is.
Going in on this cocksucker.
You know what? Because it's like, I wish a motherfucker would. Like, clearly in the video, you get some idea of my size and shape. Hopefully, the bodily mutilation through tattoos exemplifies what I'm willing to do to my body, let alone what I would do to yours. But what gets me is like, I'm not super religious, but it's always the thank God guy that's talking shit, and it's like pull up. Like, that's all. I mean, I'll give you my fucking home address. Bro's just insecure. He doesn't have functional strength. LOL. Typical gym meathead. I'm like, dude, I'm sitting there banging out bodyweight pull-ups at 275. What functional strength are you and your God talking about? Unbelievable. This guy goes, so this is the next guy. And I'm going to make sure Nathan Baldock, at Nate Baldock. So here's the thing. He's apparently 26.
First?
No,
first in his profile?
Worse. It says Melbourne. He's 26 years old. It says Melb's something Ray White. So I don't know what that is. Maybe a neighborhood in Melbourne. And it's like, I just don't like, dude, I go there. Like I'm in Melbourne and I don't know, usually once a year minimum. And it's like kind of that scene out of The Town, probably one of my favorite scenes, honestly, in any movie of all time. There's that dispute where, Ben Affleck's character is dating the girl that they kidnapped in the bank robbery, and she doesn't know it's him, obviously. And, they're on a date or whatever, and they're pretty far along. And, she makes a comment about not being able to walk through a particular neighborhood because she was getting harassed. And he kind of knows the neighborhood and knows like the guys that run it. And apparently these two guys were like harassing her and like throwing bottles at her. Do you remember the scene? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Vaguely. I have the memory of someone that has Alzheimer's. So
okay.
Please. Maybe it's like I'm watching the movie for the first time now.
I think the memory is actually
I'm in.
I think the memory is in the next Zin you're about to put in your mouth.
Well, you mean I don't have enough in now? Yeah,
go find that memory in the tin of Zin. And so Ben Affleck's character, being like kind of the onerous gangster that he is, he goes to his friend, played by Jeremy Renner, and he walks up, and it's a very famous scene where the guy's like watching games or playing video games or something. He walks in the house and he goes, "Hey, I can't tell you where we're going. I can't tell you who it is. And I can't tell you why we're doing it, but we're going to hurt some people." And I always say, "Oh, you can't ask about it later." He's like, "Well, we're going to hurt some people." And Jeremy Renner kind of like ponders for half a second and goes, "All right, well, whose car are we taking?" He's down. He's in. "You're my boy. We're going." And so they get there, and Jeremy Renner's character is like unhinged, right? That's kind of one of the subplots of the story of like this guy plays like he's got nothing to lose. He's fast and loose with it. He's got an itchy trigger finger. So they roll up with the hockey mask on, like the goalie mask on. And then they rock up to the guy's house. They know what apartment's his. They kick the door in. They beat him with fucking billy clubs. They crack the knee. And then Jeremy Renner like takes it a step too far. He like pulls out a snub-nosed revolver, shoots the guy in the fucking kneecap. But at this point, he has no idea why he's there. He's got zero clue. Wait, what are we doing? Why, whose car are we taking? And so he's got his mask on, and he says one of my favorite lines of all time. Guys like, writhing on the floor. He's had his mask on the whole time. Guys like, he's fucking bleeding out of his kneecap. It just got shot off. And he takes his mask off, and he goes in his face, and he's like, "Don't go to the cops." Or he's like, "Now you've seen my face. Don't go to the cops, because just remember, I've seen yours too." It's like, which is like, I don't give a fuck. Like, and it's like the thing with Instagram is like, dude, and it's funny because I've had some days where I just have told people like, "Hey man, like I'll send them I'll send them an address of the gym that they go to." This happened to me once with a kid in Australia. Macintosh was playing support on this. And I messaged the kid. I was like, "Hey, is this a gym you go to?" And he was talking match. He was reposting stuff about me with me blocked. And he was talking shit. And Macintosh, being the fucking friend that he is, Mac is the guy whose car are we taking? And I was just like, and I try to not engage. But one day I was just like, fuck it. And Macintosh was like, "I think I know what gym you train." I'm like, "Can you get me the address?" And I DM'd the kid. I was like, "Is this the gym you train at?" And he didn't say anything. I was like, "I'm going to be in Australia in January. Just take a look over your shoulder." And the kid like completely wanted. He started posting things nice about me, and I was like, "Oh, it's funny how that works. Isn't it funny how when you know that me and Macintosh are gonna roll up to your crib like the two fucking bald Mexican brothers from Breaking Bad and just beat your kneecaps in, dude? Like it's literally like, shut up, just train." That was the most complex explanation for someone that's saying you're looking at things too microscopically. And I look at this guy, and it's just like, I have more respect for people who comment on porn videos. Like, I really think like there's a mental delusion to people who are like who throw out negative, and so it's literally I don't know how this works because there's 62 comments, but Instagram literally only shows me the negative ones. But yeah, I shout out to the first person who makes an app that lets you figure out where these people live like immediately. Like that's like a prerequisite. Like, you sure you want to post this? Your address is going to be sent to his DM. Oh,
I mean, we know some people that work at Meta. We might be able to work this out. I feel like there's got to be some sort of way we can get an address.
that's
But
like
being tough on the internet is the exact opposite of actually being tough.
right.
Like anyone that I have respect for in real life that has an ounce of toughness or masculinity, they're not that on the internet because they just don't give a fuck. Like, imagine getting upset about a sponsored ad that got fed to you on Meta. Like, upset to the point where you take time out of your day to waste your valuable brain capacity and time to type something derogatory towards that person. The lowest of the low, man.
Yeah, I the one that got me was the one that I know I could find. And like, if someone listening knows this guy, tell our boy in Australia what was his name. That I'd happily sit and have a chat with him. And the thing is, like, yeah, Nathan Baldock, 26 years old. Your brain has just formed, you stupid idiot. I have forgotten more about exercise than you will ever know in your life. And like, dude, I can zoom in on your profile. Oh, you want to talk punchable faces, dog? Oh my
This guy's
god.
got fuck face.
Can our camera get this? I don't
Yeah, let me lean
fuck
in
you.
a bit.
Fuck you. I'll put you on blast, motherfucker. This, that is a punchable face. Unbelievable, And
Can we start a campaign to bring back fist fights?
So they tried this in Australia, actually. Well, they called it king hitting, and they were just walking around punching people in the head.
But that's different because that's like a sucker punch. Like, I want this to be an arranged, like, we're going to show up, a little pat down, no knives, no weapons, no guns, and we're just going to fight until someone's right and someone's wrong.
So this is so it's hashtag bring back. Is World Star still around? I feel like World Star was what World Star was.
Yeah. Reels is doing big things for me in aggression. I just have like an entire feed on my Explore page of street fights. It's pretty sick.
So my theory is that AI has already taken over, and it actually started taking over years ago. And what AI actually is now in its weaponized form is the runaway algorithm. I don't think that Meta, as so far as it services Instagram, actually has control over the platform anymore. I think the platform is run entirely autonomously through AI. And I think what it's doing in a total tinfoil hat here. I was actually thinking about this today. I had a long drive back from London, Ontario, and like the same type of thing. I don't go on the Explore page. Now, like, you're forced to, like, if I'm trying to look up your profile, you're forced to go to the Explore page to look you up. Like, if I need to find you for whatever reason, and it forces the Explore page. So I only go on it as so far as I need to use it to get to people that I know. And I'm wondering what behaviors I've exhibited on the app or even in my life in general that serves me up what I see on my Explore page. Like, what actions have triggered the thumbnails of what gets shown to me? Because it's like, if anyone were to look at that, they'd be like, yo, you have some explaining to do. Because it's that. It's like, it's things that are like heinous crimes, or it's basically what would be tantamount to pornography. And I'm just like, I don't think that a human being logically, if the goal is to keep engaging with the app, or at least engage with that part of the app, is behind this at all. I think it's AI trying to kill humans in the way it knows how. It's like, oh, we just like serve up all this aggressive shit. Then everyone's just going to fight, and then it's going to be over, and then they can be left alone. That's my theory.
All right, I can support that. I don't know. I think there's a point in human psychology that really intersects with porn and violence, where that's really what they want to see.
I mean,
I,
what's the evolutionary difference percentage wise between us and apes? Like 1.7 or 1.3% or something like that. Like apes are 98 point something percent similar to humans.
yeah, I can see
I
that.
hope the 1.7%, that's essentially the difference, is porn and violence.
Yeah, it's just easier to find when you have thumbs.
Well, I mean, we saw, dude, how it was weird. It was the first time that I saw a monkey in real life was when you and I were in Thailand.
Okay.
Was that your first time?
I mean, maybe at a zoo or something, but like in that scenario, like that was a very unique scenario for me.
Yeah. Were you a little bit weirded out?
Yeah. They're like the intelligence and mannerisms are a little bit too close to feel comfortable near that. Like I don't know how to read them the same way I would a human, but the mannerisms are close enough where it made me a little uneasy.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't cool with that. I was trying to like be I mean, what saved me was that they weren't that big. Like
Right. Yeah.
if they were on some Planet of the Apes shit and they were like human sized with
Yeah.
those mannerisms, like that they're like junkies is what they are. They're kind of like
Yeah.
junkies. They're like junkies are a little bit like, they're skittish, they're sketchy. They're always, you know what I noticed today? If my neck is itchy, I itch it on the same side with the same side of my hand, or sorry. So let's say the right side of my neck is itchy. London, Ontario is fucking insane. And we'll talk about fitness stuff in a second, I'm
I
sure.
know where you're going with this.
Okay, so it's like I never realized that this was a thing, and I don't know how the drugs work to make this possible, but I noticed, right, when my neck itches on the right side of my body, I scratch it with my right hand. When it scratches or it itches on the left side of my body, I itch it with my left hand. Meth or whatever the fuck these people were on, it crosses. There's something, it crosses a wire. Because like you will, and that's how I'm like, okay, crazy. And like, I don't know, I live in Toronto now, so there's like a fair few crazy people. And that's always like, one, if you're scratching yourself in public, I'm always like, all right, what's this fucker doing? But if you are asymmetric, if you are left-right asymmetric and you're a scratching approach, you're like on some sort of hard drug. I was in my car, it was red light. I'm like, I took my left hand and I was like, it felt like brushing your teeth with the other. I was like, why are they always doing this? Why is it this always cross body approach? Oh, and it's so unbelievably reproducible. It's like every time I see a scabby meth head, it's always like, why aren't you just scratching it with the same?
Man, it probably never occurred to them. Yeah, I'm drawing more parallels to monkeys and meth heads because I think like the point at which I'm intimidated by a monkey is like probably around 60 pounds. If it's 60 pounds or larger, that's going to be a problem. Like I'm going to incur some damage in this interaction.
Right.
Same thing with a meth head. Like if you're 60 pounds or larger and you're on meth, like, all right, you have my full attention.
Yeah, anything to kind of borrow from Shane Gillis, anything I can't punch assassinate, I'm kind of like, that's kind of my line. If I can't kill you by punching your head in, or like a swift, I'm not like a Muay Thai guy or anything like that. But like, I like the size of human creature that I could confidently kill with a good kick. And like a good mediocre, I'm like, not soccer. I can kick a soccer ball, but like I'm not trained in the art of kicking. Like friend of the show, Joey Sly, professional kicker, plays in the NFL, plays for the New England Patriots.
Man,
He could kick, assassinate, a full grown man.
Yes.
That's kind of like, if I can't, with a 2-step approach, boot this thing to a point of submission with my skill level, as minimal as it is, I think that's kind of, and I think 60 pounds, you nailed it. That's probably, because at a certain point when you go to the mall and there's like, you've been in the mall in a rough neighborhood and there's like 10-year-olds, but some of them are 14. And you're like, all right, the 10-year-old, I think he's 10. But like my dividing line between like this if they all went ape shit, proper term, and kicked off on some stuff, which one of these is going to start to be a problem? And it's probably around that threshold. Like if you go to the movies and you're like, oh, these 3 kids, and it's like if they're below, kickable incapacitation, then we're fine.
Mm.
But if they're at a weight where it's above that, you're like, oh fuck, okay. Like, I'll get a few of them, but I'm gonna catch a lick during this exchange. This is what I think. This is why I don't go to the public, man. This is why I stay inside my fucking closet and record podcasts, because it's
not worth it.
It's wild out there, dude. It's wild. All right.
It is.
That was it for today. You know what? I feel like this is actually classic RX style.
We said we were taking it back to the roots, and we didn't fucking lie.
No. An unhinged salvo about violence, and then let's get into something technical. Last week we talked about leg hypertrophy. What's the segue?
The segue, perfect segue. 60-pound meth heads into the correlation between function and output in the shoulder. How about that?
Oh, we're just gonna lean in on it. All right, we're gonna. This is for underscore Usman, cocksucker.
Yeah. He's probably got too many dicks in his ears to hear this, but
I don't swear enough on the pod. You know what it is? So sorry to cut you off. I found this the other day that I've actually Instagram's algorithm has really like adjusted how I approach the app, and it was really unsettling to me. Like I don't repost stuff a lot, like of my own, because it was like it doesn't go anywhere anyways. I'm like, why do I care? Why do I care? Like if someone posts something of mine or like takes a picture or whatever, L1 lecture podcast, I got in the habit of not reposting it because I got in the habit of like looking at metrics. I was like, who gives a fuck? So, and one of the things that I have done a lot less is I swear a lot less on, and I'm like, that's not me. And even on the podcast. So I'd like to start swearing more if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I support that. I've actually adopted the approach of swearing less because I have irrehensible thoughts. And if I were to share them on the podcast, like it might not be good for viewership. But if that's the page we're going to turn here in RX radio history, I support it. I'll try and keep it, what would be the PG-13 for my brain.
Let's try it. I think, I forget where I was. This is such a weird thought. I forget where I was when I was calling someone a cocksucker in public the other day. And I was like, I feel like that really relayed a message. I feel like you got it. It does. Yeah. It does. And you know what? There's a couple of words, and a lot of times they're on like the no-fly list with most people. And I think we've talked about this before. That indicate to someone, that communicate to someone that I'm done with language after this. And I think that is actually a really useful tool. Cocksucker, I think, is one of them. There was an event. Now I don't condone what was said, but an interesting thing had transpired from it. You and I had discussed this yesterday over text thread about the dude from the Red Sox. Did you see the follow-up of that today?
No, I did not.
So there's something called the silent majority. And it's like, I tend to not. There's a group of people on the internet that, and we'll get into shoulder stability and hypertrophy and that, but maybe one last kick at the can on like the absolutely inane shit that we talk about when we're not talking about fitness.
I like where this is going.
Okay. So, look. There's a group of people on like the center or to the right who we're in our 30s now. You start to prioritize things differently. You start to be worried about different things, and like politics gets on the radar of a lot of people. Which not to say they should or shouldn't, but there's people who hold certain contrarian views to like they're very outspoken on the right. And it's a weird intersection with fitness. And I just find them to be like, they're just not really thoughtful, right? Like they don't really, they just think they hear something that's popular and then maybe a little bit left leaning and they're just immediately anti that. So like, just like the people who are crazy left leaning. And again, Toronto is a wild city for like the blue hair crew and, name, I couldn't care. I couldn't waste energy on it. But like, when you meet someone who I go to a coffee shop and it's a hipster joint, and there's like a girl that works there, but she's not a girl anymore, and it's like that's cool, and she's super nice, but like she'll take certain political views or she'll take certain stances on world events where like you kind of saw it coming. You kind of knew with the blue hair and the name change and all that, her view on the Ukraine, Russia, Israel, all of that. You kind of know right away. And like I've gotten to know her, and all of my suspicions about those things are true. And I try to not lump people together. It's just I find that fairly reproducible. And now there's people who are on the other side of that, who like, they have like a buzz cut and a bunch of tattoos and kind of just think a certain way. That's just the exact opposite of that. It's like, okay, well, like maybe you feel a different way about that. The majority of people, I think, are fairly centered and they don't make any noise, but they're kind of tired of like bending to the will of, the public discourse engine and people getting in trouble for saying shit. Back to my point. You and I were discussing, I forget his name, the baseball player on the Red Sox. I don't know if you remember it.
I never knew it.
So if for those of you guys unaware, there was a player on, I'm going to turn my volume down as to his name was Jaron Duran. Casually just tosses out something as he's walking to the plate, getting heckled by like someone in the third row. Some guy's just like, telling him he needs a tennis racket, making the insinuation that he's not good at hitting a baseball. And he casually looks at the guy, Fenway Park, Boston Red Sox, on TV, and just says something that you would have said to someone in the 5th grade on the playground.
Right.
The next day, so he gets suspended, which I thought was hilarious for baseball. They suspended him for 2 games, which is nothing. That's not even
like we got to do something here. We can't do nothing, but we don't really care.
The next day, his jersey has sold more single day. So in one day, his jersey has sold more copies. He's sold more jerseys in one day than any baseball player in history.
Yeah. It's an interesting point because I think that there's certain things that people just avoid in conversation just because there's a popular opinion that if you say these things, you think a certain way. When that's kind of a logical leap as opposed to being the actual truth. And I think people just avoid certain things altogether. And that's like ways of speaking, topics of conversation, like religion, politics, views on transgender or gay rights, things like that. People they don't bring it up. They don't talk about it because they don't want to go through the process of actually like getting to the root of the issue as opposed to the surface level. Oh, you said that, like you're a terrible person. And the whole cancel culture, like everyone's so woke nowadays. When you like a parallel I'll draw is murder. Like there can be justifiable murders, right? I think we can, like as a human society, we can say murder is probably bad. But there's certain situations where we'll be like, yep, that person deserves to die. That person should be murdered. Death penalty is appropriate in that scenario. And the context matters, right? And no one can tell you the intention of what you're saying. I think people make it very clear in specific scenarios, but like that one that you're talking about, like the context probably is exactly what you're saying. Like this guy was getting heckled. He's like, man, this guy fucking sucks. Like I want to say something mean to him. And this is like, it has a mean connotation, but I don't necessarily mean anything deeper than that. Then like I want to say something that would piss this person off or like would give them some sort of emotional reaction, but I don't have any political views or any real sort of emotion towards this word other than like pissing this person off. Like kind of same thing with murder. Like if I went out and I just murdered someone senselessly, like probably going to be frowned upon. That person has a family, they have, people that care about them in this world, but if you murder someone that, the solution for the guy that shot Trump was to kill him instantly. And not many people are upset about that. I think that's what you're saying in this scenario. Not many people are very upset about what this baseball player said.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I am curious to see how many, like, if I'm Trump, I'm selling that as a bundle. People who bought the MAGA hat also bought this jersey. Like, I don't know where the next rally is, but I'm really curious of how many red, because it's a Boston Red Sox. It matches. It's perfect.
Yeah.
I think someone
Yeah.
on the internet's going to get wise at a Shopify checkout and be like, "Hey, I got this bundle app, MAGA
Yeah.
hat with a Duran jersey. We're out the
It
door."
comes with the Band-Aid on the ear.
Oh my god, incredible! You be this guy for Halloween. That's like a costume for Halloween.
Oh, for
Okay, what did
sure.
we
You know
what
it
did
will
we
be.
say we were getting into? Shoulders.
Yeah. So Usman thinks pull-ups are not good for shoulder function. I think that's the point at which we're. Yeah, that's definitely what we intended to talk about on this podcast.
Seriously.
Um, yeah, to kind of turn this thing around, I guess we could start to talk about shoulder function being necessary for output and training, right? I think we've seen this swing in the industry where people are taking things a little bit too literal on the theoretical side of things, where they see an exercise and they point out everything that's wrong with it, everything that doesn't align with the specific goals of that athlete or that person. Say if it's hypertrophy training, they'll knock a pull up, or they won't put a pull up in the program because it's not the most ideal way to align the force of gravity with the muscle fibers of the lat. So it's not an effective hypertrophy movement for the lat. And theoretically, I think you can draw that conclusion. You can do that, and you can do it logically. But in application, it's not actually the truth, because you and I have seen it time and time again. There's people who pursue hypertrophy training and they do it with this sort of rationale, but over time, if there's not an underlying vein of function in the program that they're running, there's going to be a diminished output over time because they're starting to lose, say, range of motion. They're limited to a specific range of motion in which they can train through. There's a diminished ability to stabilize the spine, the scapula, and therefore the shoulder joint itself. So there's not going to be the ability to put as much of a meaningful stimulus through those joints because that underlying stability isn't there. And that's what I would boil this point down to, is that if we want to be able to train something effectively, like a lat crosses the majority of the spine. It crosses the entire lumbar, thoracic, the scapulothoracic, and the glenohumeral joint. If there's any sort of lapse in stability along the way, then we're going to have a diminished capacity to produce force through that specific muscle group. So anything where you're talking about shoulder function, it really has to start with lumbar stability. It has to start with thoracic stability. There has to be a conversation around scapulothoracic stability and glenohumeral joint stability before you can really, we'll say, optimize output through that specific muscle group. And I think that's an overlooked point when it comes to the idea of hypertrophy training or maximizing output in that specific scenario.
Yeah, I just think bottlenecks, right? Like I when you take a look at an exercise program. So if you guys are listening to this and you're, whether you write programming for people, you write programming for yourself, try and dig down for every exercise, like every exercise you have on paper, every exercise that you do. Try and figure out what is the guiding principle of this exercise that's putting it in my program. Like number one, like what does it do? Like I think people kind of get, they get sound bites through social media, or they overhear stuff from the gym, whereas sometimes they just do it because they've always done it. And I think what you learn over time with training is you learn that the bullseye of like meaningful adaptable stimulus is not as small as you thought it was before. I think that's real training wisdom, is that you're what you think has to be this, like, this head of a needle of a target you need to hit is actually more like the broadside of a barn. And the more you start to realize that people who are cast as outliers or genetic freaks aren't that at all. They're just people who are hitting the broadside of a barn. And you're looking for a needle in a haystack as far as like what you need to accomplish from a threshold standpoint to actually get the stimulus that you need to elicit an adaptation that we all desire. So when we look at common approaches for training, let's stay obviously sticking with the upper extremity, building up around the shoulder, the driving process of most people's exercise is length tension relationship. So for those of you, whether or not you know that's the case, whether you know what those words mean, let's explain. The length tension relationship is just that, is how much tension can a muscle create at a particular length. So whenever you hear someone reference, we're training this muscle in its lengthened position, we're training this muscle in its shortened position, we're training this muscle in its mid-range position, what the principle that's guiding that language is the principle of length tension. Now, that is one mechanism at play, right? But there's what is born out of that is, this is where, and I hate to use the word, and maybe I'll give it a little bit more context. Most people now, when they speak about optimal hypertrophy training, which is almost, a vomit-inducing term, just with how much it's bastardized, what they are referring to is the decisions they're making in exercise, selection, setup, stabilization, and execution are optimized for the lens of length tension, right? Now, the thing that I find so paradoxical with people who optimize their exercise selection for length tension, what they are attempting to do is they are attempting to get the most out of every muscle in a particular movement. And like, hey, fair play. That sounds like a fair goalpost to kick towards. Like, why wouldn't you want to get that? Because there's a whole bunch of other things you need to focus on to keep the train on the track so you can continue to do that for a long time. I would say I have like not necessarily a formula, but there's boxes that I prioritize in my training that are much broader, right? So I think I'll have per muscle group, maybe once or twice a week, depending on the size of the muscle group, I will have something that optimizes for length tension, or I will have something that optimizes for an inefficient length tension. And this is where you need to realize, like, look, I like training. I like training for at least an hour. In a perfect world, I would love to get back to the point where I train for 2 hours. If I'm training for 2 hours, I have to understand length tension, but not from the standpoint of, optimizing for length tension in every exercise, because my workouts would be 35 minutes. If I'm taking every muscle I train behind the fucking woodshed and really, putting this stimulus that's waving in accordance with the amount of tension my muscle can produce, they talk about stimulus to fatigue. It's another concept that's worth knowing, and it's another concept that's rooted solely in the length tension relationship. That's really effective. Stimulus to fatigue, which means, if I do all these exercises that are optimized for length tension, and I train, one or two muscle groups in a session, and I use a handful of exercises, I don't have that many working sets, right? My repeated ability at that muscle group will be diminished because it'll have undergone so much stimulus, which sounds great. But what if I want to train what if I want to build a work capacity, which is like the enter first bottleneck to long-term hypertrophy? Like, if you take someone who optimizes for length tension, but at no point optimizes for work, and then you put them in a scenario where they have to have some sort of like strength endurance, right, in less than optimal settings, in exercises that are optimized for work rather than stimulus, which, or by their language, would be fatigue rather than stimulus, then they gas out, right? And this is where we start running into problems, because most of the lifting that we do outside the gym is grossly inefficient by the terms of length tension, right? And this is where I think bodybuilding has gotten away from the idea of work capacity. And work capacity carries with it so many different facets that are going to be indirectly important to hypertrophy. Like, if you take someone and you take someone who optimizes their training for the length tension relationship. You use the lat is a very common one, and you take them and put them on something like a single arm dumbbell row. The coordination, the ability for simultaneous muscular co-contraction, and the output metabolically that demands of someone to integrate those systems, it fucks them. And it's like, okay, like you actually need the stimulus to fatigue ratio is not something that you need to optimize purely for stimulus and diminish fatigue, because at a certain point you're going to be so bottlenecked to your work capacity that you're not going to be able to get enough stimulus in. So when you look at an exercise program, and there's an infinite number of ways that you can decipher the mechanism of each exercise, but you need to solve for more problems than just the direct stimulus to hypertrophy. You need to a lot of times solve for the bottlenecks, whether it be quote unquote functional, right? Like if you can't get into certain positions, like if you have an inability to co-contract, if you have an inability to stabilize outside of like a presence of a machine, you're going to be diminishing your long-term ability to drive stimulus. So what I suggest, and kind of like a method that I try to impart on people, is like, look, let's take a look at your program. Tell me what you're optimizing for, right? Oh, this exercise is optimizing for the lengthened position, and this exercise is optimizing for the okay. Look, it's just one thing. Okay, that's one thing. Well, okay, what is your problem? Like, well, I'm not really strong in these exercises. It's like, okay, let's optimize for strength. What does that look like? If I said optimize for strength, what would you do? Well, if I was optimizing for strength, I would do like deadlifts. I was like, okay, well, why don't you deadlift? It's like, well, deadlifting is not optimal for length tension relationships. It's like, but your issue is that you're not strong enough for any of the cute stuff you're doing. So, but why are you optimizing for that when this to be your bottleneck, right? Or, I know people who get their clients to, and I've seen this a lot lately, actually, where people are getting their clients to do some of these exercises that are optimized for length tension relationship. And I look at them in between sets, they're like gassed, like some sort of single arm supported row, absolutely fucked. And I'm like, what do you think that person's bottleneck is? Like, why can't they do more on the single arm thing? And it's like, they're just not in really good shape. I'm like, well, why don't you optimize for conditioning? Like, why not? Why aren't they on an assault bike and doing some sort of interval thing, right? Because there's a lot of bottlenecks that stand in the way. And here's what I found, and this is where like people who don't understand CrossFit is actually just a really good example of this, because when most people, if you were to ask people on the street, what physique do you aspire to? Most people would probably land at something that looks like a CrossFitter, right? More than average muscle mass, big engine, good work capacity, fairly uniform muscularity from upper to lower body, fairly symmetrical and super capable. So say what you want to go CrossFit, but if you're talking shit, to me, it's a relatively unwise approach to talk shit about CrossFit. And if you were to look at CrossFit programming, I don't think you could find an exercise that is optimized for muscle hypertrophy. What you will find is exercises in every program, in every WOD, that are optimized for minimizing the bottlenecks of hypertrophy, and hypertrophy occurs as a byproduct of removing those bottlenecks, right? Like a lot of people who, and I'm sure our boy Usman there, thank God, bless up Usman, bless up. I don't know where the fuck you live, motherfucker, cocksucker. Feels good. Just it has an umph to it, right? It really lands on the ear well. But I just like, I would imagine that based off of his punchable face, that he doesn't carry any appreciable muscle mass, and that any female CrossFitter that's been doing anything competitive for the last 2 years hold more muscle mass than him. And they are optimizing for removing bottlenecks, right? It's addition by subtraction, and then hypertrophy occurs, right? And the thing with what I found, and I've found this through training with you, is hypertrophy as this eye of a needle that we need to fish our programming through, rather than a barn door. When we take you out of your world, now obviously you've been a competitive weightlifter for many years and your CrossFit days long since behind you, but even in your most competitive days, I could put you on a machine that you've never done before, in a plane of motion that you've never worked on, a profile. Even still, I mean, I could put you on a hack squat and you could fuck anyone up, right? And it's just so, because what you've done is you've optimized for work. You've optimized for removing the bottlenecks, and the stimulus comes easy, right? And I think most people, when we look at shoulder function, and like I hear in my head, because I have to deal with these stupid comments, when you're talking about scapulohumeral stability or glenohumeral stability or lumbar spine stability, I hear the criticisms. I hear people who don't understand how the body works. Well, stability, like there's like there's a guy in the industry. I'm not going to name his name because I don't have the patience. But like there are particular people out there who don't like the word stability, and I feel somewhat responsible. And correct me if I'm wrong. I feel somewhat responsible for bringing that word to the forefront of the industry. And anyone who bats around this idea of stability being a thing or not, I personally, and I could be totally delusional. Like there's a lot of that going around, but I feel and know in some cases, because I'm directly called out, that people associate that term with me and us and what we talk about. It's like you can't run away from it. You can't try and call it something else. It is what it is, right? Like it is the muscle's ability to resist force autonomically. I don't know what another word would be, but when you start to look at programming that doesn't have that element of the external environment demanding something of the internal environment, what you're usually seeing is bottlenecks. So when you look for programming hypertrophy, and we'll try and bring this more prescriptive after, but I think the high level principle is your focus isn't on the singular problem, because the more you focus on like hypertrophy and stimulus and fatigue and length tension as your guiding light, the more the eye of that needle in your approach gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until you can't even see it anymore. It's like if you focus on removing bottlenecks, that's super easy, right? Like, I don't know, go to prison and then look how jacked motherfuckers are.
And go
start a fist fight with your punchable face, make it less punchable, go to prison, get an even less punchable face, and then work out with people who have to optimize for work rather than hypertrophy, and watch what happens. So like, I really think, again, I say this every time I'm dissecting problem solving with anyone. It's like you're framing it improperly. The frame is not how can I hyper focus on hypertrophy. The frame is how do I remove the bottlenecks to hypertrophy. Then we start to look at things like pull-ups, things like dips, things like bent over barbell rows. You start to see now that what we're optimizing for with those movements is we're optimizing for efficiently removing those bottlenecks, removing the bottleneck of like a spine that can't organize itself, removing the bottleneck of a shoulder that can't internally rotate, a scapula that can't upwardly rotate in the case of a dip, right? A shoulder that can't get in the overhead position in the case of a pull-up. So magical things happen when you remove those bottlenecks. We had, and it's probably the second time I've mentioned in the last couple of months, we had Dan Garner on the podcast, and his approach to nutrition with Sean O'Malley, the UFC fighter, is just that. When he's trying to lose weight, he's removing environmental impediments to metabolism, right? He's removing stress, psychological stress was the first thing he talked about. He talked about like stress-induced, I forget the name of the term, but it was basically like you decrease stomach acid because of physiological stress or psychological stress. So he's like, you end up with this gut that doesn't work because you're stressed out. And all I have to do is figure out a way to remove that first. So like when we program for hypertrophy, and this is true of anywhere, but I think it's most commonly missed in the shoulder, there's a clinician named, I'm blanking on his name. He has this great quote. He says, if he who focuses on the site of pain is lost. Perry Mickelson. And I like that in a similar sort of an analog to what we're talking about, because if you're focusing on hypertrophy, you're missing the point, right? You need to focus on the things that are getting in the way, and you can do that for years. There are so many things that you can do. And then when you're on the other side of it, then maybe you can dose in some of these things that are optimized for length tension. But you need to optimize for work and you need to optimize for function. And those are in most cases, that's what's optimizing for hypertrophy.
Yeah. I agree with pretty much all of that. And I think of it in very similar but slightly different ways as well. If we're trying to optimize, whether it's for hypertrophy, whether it's strength, whether it's for sport, there's going to be a degree of inefficiency along the way, right? Like if we look at hypertrophy training, really what we're trying to do is we're creating maximum inefficiency in a specific movement to maximally train a specific muscle group. Like isolation movements are inefficient movements. That's not how a hip, like a quad extension is not how a hip works. That's not how a knee works. That's not how a quad works in the integrated system of the lower body. And similar thing with the lat. Like if I'm trying to train a lat, I'm not going to necessarily do that in a way that's consistent with the way that a shoulder works or a scapula works. I'm really trying to disadvantage as many muscle groups as I can so that I can bias a lat if it's hypertrophy training. Now, if we're talking strength training, there needs to be a maximal degree of efficiency, of integration. I need to use as many muscles that complete that range of motion or act on that joint as possible to carry out the action. So they're kind of two opposite goals, but I've never met someone that's really strong that doesn't have big muscles. And I've never met someone with big muscles that isn't really strong. So the way that I look at this, they're not necessarily different goals, but it's a different endpoint that we're looking for. So as we start to look at these things, I think function is, and I'll define that in a second, but I think function is the buy-in for either of those. And a really simple definition of function, whether we're talking shoulder and hip, really, it's not necessarily different in my mind. We need to be able to resist and create force in ranges of motion. And that tells me there's a high degree of function in that joint, right? We can carry out full biomechanical function through full range of motion of the joint. Whether that's shoulder or hip, we're looking to get into flexion with external rotation and be able to resist and create force there. If we're trying to get into extension and internal rotation, same exact thing. That's going to be function at that joint. And function is going to be the thing that allows us the variability to do everything in between. So as we look at that, I think that people are missing this connection between function and output. It's really just a misunderstanding or a lack of prioritization in training. Is you're not understanding how we can prioritize these things to be able to stack them in training. And you said the fatigue to stimulus ratio, like what does that look like? And I think of it even just in the scope of a session. Like if we think of optimization, we can look at optimization of an exercise for a specific goal, yes. Or we can look at optimization of a session for a specific goal. We can look at optimization over a week of training for a specific goal, or optimization over an entire phase of training for a specific goal. So I think if you're looking at optimization for a specific movement, you're too close to it. Yes, we do want to be optimizing these things within some sort of actionable way for the goal at hand, but that's typically not every specific movement and neglecting other things that don't fall in that. Because if we're looking at optimization of a session for, say, lat hypertrophy, we can become more effective if we understand that fatigue to stimulus ratio. Like if we start out a session with something that's going to get us into full flexion, external rotation at the shoulder, or full extension with internal rotation at the shoulder, then we're going to be able to have an adaptable stimulus within an end range that is a much lower level of fatigue than if we just loaded up a T-bar row. So if we're going through our workout, we do some sort of warm up. We get overhead, we get the arm behind the body, and then we start out with a pull up. That's going to be a very effective movement to now create a great level of stability and train the lat to some degree. It may not be the most meaningful hypertrophy stimulus, but it is a hypertrophy stimulus, and it's going to be less fatiguing than something that is more loadable. And the thing that's going to be the linchpin in that exercise, the area in which that's going to fail, is going to be either spinal stability or scapular stability. I can't think of anyone I've ever met that can take a pull up to muscular fatigue in the lat. That's probably not going to be your limiting factor there. And if it is, then hypertrophy is probably not your goal in training, because you can do this thing to such a far degree that it's not something that lends towards hypertrophy being the end goal, or the overarching theme of training. So what we can do is we can use that as something that you're going to get a stimulus from, and it's going to create some level of fatigue, but a very low level of fatigue in the muscle group that we're training. And now what we can do is we can put you into a movement that is more externally stabilized, that even if you don't know how to use your core, you don't know how to stabilize your scapula, something like a T-bar row. Now, if we think length tension relationship, we can create tension through two different ways. We can do it through length, or we can do it through load, right? We just did it through length in a pull-up, right? Load's going to be relatively constant unless we're adding weight. Yes, we can do that, but it's not going to be the most effective means of creating fatigue or stimulus through load. But now we're going into this more loadable means with a level of fatigue, which is not a bad thing, because that means that now we can reach the same meaningfulness in terms of fatigue in a T-bar row, but we can do it with less load because there's already been some sort of stimulus of fatigue, and we can still load it to a meaningful degree. But just because we're entering that with fatigue doesn't mean that more load is better. In my mind, that means more load is more, or less load is more efficient. We can get more out of doing less. So if we take a step back and we look at optimization of a week of training, now we have gotten a greater or equal stimulus with less load. So now I can recover faster from that session, and I can have a better training stimulus or a similar training stimulus in less time. So if we're thinking about optimization, I want to destroy my lats in this training session, I'm only going to do things that do that without focusing on function or without focusing on load management throughout a training day. Then when's the next time you're going to be able to elicit that stimulus again? It's probably going to create a longer time in between training stimuluses. And if you look at that over a training phase, now have you become less effective because you've trained that muscle group less often, because you fried your lats in this one session and you weren't able to do it for another 5 days as opposed to 3 days. Now, how many training days have we accumulated in addition because we were able to be better at prioritizing exercise selection and using function to get more out of less load, creating a higher degree of recoverability in a shorter amount of time? And now maybe we've accumulated 5, 6, 7 extra training sessions over that training phase that would far outweigh the stimulus that you're getting just by optimizing for lat contraction in every single session. So I think it's just an issue with prioritization. I think that's what is going on in that lack of understanding around how function interplays with output.
Yeah, I want to clarify function, because like you're painting a really clear picture of how most people are looking at hypertrophy training now. And the thing is, one thing that's always missing, one dimension that's always missing when people are making arguments on the internet is, well, how does this play out over time? Right? Like what's good for some isn't good for others. We know that. Like some of the, I really fuck with Jordan Peters. Jordan Peters, brutally strong across all movements that he does, but he'll even go on as periodically and be like, look, my workouts are not for you, right? Because I've been doing this, I've been training this way. I haven't missed a rep. I haven't missed a session. I haven't missed a meal. So, he has to find himself continually doubling back and creating this disclaimer. But I think it's worth looking at this concept across time. Because I think a lot of times what people are doing when they're arguing on the internet is they're creating a context in which you're wrong, right? And so
right.
like they're context vultures, if they will. So they're looking at a time in someone's training career going like, well, that's stupid. It's like, look, there's stuff that I did back when I was a kid that would be stupid for me to do now. I don't regret doing it because it gave me an unbelievable base. Like I used to back squat 495, drops at 405, drops at 315, drops at 225, drops at 135, and do that for 5 sets. And then I would do the same thing on deadlifts after. And it's like, okay, but I'll always be like, I could be like riddled with a disease and I'll be 220. Right. Like I just can't be smaller than that because I've Deadpooled myself as a teenager. Right. So I don't regret it. Again, if I did it now, like you're talking to a guy who shredded his meniscus walking on a sidewalk, like we're different people now. But I want to take what we're talking about and put it in the long-term context and create like a timeline of, taking this principle of function, which I want to dig in a little bit deeper, taking this concept of starting, and this is where I think hopefully we're going to start getting more prescriptive, and I'll double back to the intro and start to earmark the rough 55-minute when you started to say your last piece. And this episode got, I think, hopefully valuable, is to, the concept of starting your exercise, your workouts with some sort of, non-efficient by length tension standards, but efficient by function standards, as far as getting into some of these end ranges, and what that landmark, what that mile marker does for an exercise program long term. So I want to start with the definition of function, and hopefully my whole idea can come through in this. Function is a word that when I think we're saying it, what we're actually mean is joint mechanics. I think that's what we mean when we mean function. And one of the things I tell Chiro students often is I think we have a distinct upper hand in our education being so focused on the structure of bones and joints, right? And I think a lot of Chiros don't realize that in the muscular world, that joint function is one of the major constraints. Not a limiter, like you can work around it, but if we want to talk about efficiency of movement and optimizing for efficiency and efficient stimulus to fatigue, then understanding the common denominator movements at the joints in which the muscles we're trying to train work, that's really potent information. Right. So, you talked about the scapulothoracic joint, glenohumeral joint. So the principle of scapulohumeral rhythm, when you actually understand, how the shoulder blade articulates with the rib cage and as a byproduct, the humerus in going through motions in the overhead or into shoulder extension, like in a dip or overhead in a pull up, that you're looking at like something akin to like friction, let's say. Like you're looking at, am I creating undue friction at a joint? Because look, friction at a joint is different than stimulus at a muscle, right? So for an example of this, and I really hope I can land this, and it's going to take me about 5 or 10 minutes to do it. But if you're doing a lateral raise, right? So when people learn about scapulohumeral rhythm, which is to say the relationship between the humerus and the scapula as the shoulder moves, and they kind of get this notion that scapulohumeral rhythm is a 2-to-1 relationship, which means the 2 degrees my humerus moves, my scapula moves 1 degree. And it's not the case. It's inconsistently that. That's the too zoomed out. What happens is as you move your arm more into end ranges of motion, the scapula becomes disproportionately more involved. So my arm's at my side and I'm just kind of like walking around. My shoulder blade really doesn't have to do anything. It's not until I hit about 60 degrees and onward that my scapula becomes increasingly more involved in this process, right? Involved in getting my arm in the overhead position. So like you can do this literally with no weight sitting down. If you try and immobilize your scapula and go through like a lateral raise, so keep your if you're sitting at your desk or you're at a red light or whatever, you don't have people next to you that are going to hit in the face. If you keep your shoulder blades like pinned, and I get to about 60 degrees, I can feel tension in my delts. What I'm feeling is a sense of almost friction that my structure, like the mechanics of the adjacent joints that make up the ball and socket of my shoulder, are creating some sort of friction now, right? Like whether it's the joint capsule, whether it's ligaments, whether it's just I'm literally running out of room in the socket for the ball to move through, and the ball needs to accommodate that. I could do that, and I feel like it's almost hard to do now. I feel a tension in my delts doing this, keeping my shoulder blades immobilized and not allowing for that expression of scapulohumeral rhythm to occur. That friction, let's call it, is not tension, right? And if I were to add weight to that, and not really respect the underlying mechanics of the joint, I wouldn't get anywhere. The muscle just wouldn't, because I'm perceiving what feels like what tension feels like, but it's really just an inefficiency of the joint itself, right? So what you minimize when you go through, like, let's say your first exercise. So we're going to transition. So let's like kind of earmark that function. When we say it, by and large, we're talking about integrating joint mechanics into our muscular mechanic approach of resistance training, because we don't want our joints to be limiting how much our muscles can withstand or exert force on. So that like, let's put that aside. You talked about pull-ups and dips. Those can, by the category, by the definition of function being that, talking about joint mechanics, it's very easy to see. Maybe not, but the more you understand resistance training and anatomy, it should be very easy to see some of the end ranges of the joints that you're putting in with those exercises, right? So dip, you said extension, internal rotation, getting the overhead position. We're talking flexion, external rotation of the shoulder with a pull up. This is where I really like this as a litmus test, because most people can't walk into the gym and do those things. What do they need to do those things? They need to warm up. Great. Let's do that. Let's warm up to the goal of being able to walk into the gym and be able to do that. My warm-ups now are laughably short. And they get a little bit longer if I'm traveling or if I'm not sleeping well, whatever. But the target for my warm-up is not to directly support some sort of hypertrophy endeavor. The target for my warm-up is to be able to remove the friction. Right, my warm-ups, and I challenge people. We'll do a lower body because I like this concept, and I hope I can articulate what I'm thinking effectively here. It would be the first time, but if I take those exercises, and for me it is quite literally dips and pull-ups for the upper body. I think just given the vector of the force and the position of the joint, those are the most effective at picking you apart. Those are two that are probably the hardest to do. Standing overhead press, it's scalable. It's not relevant to body weight. Dips and lats or pull-ups are relevant to body weight. If I make that the goal, I say, hey, this is a testament to how much function I have, which if we peel back and really define with like sub line items, we can say, okay, the function of the shoulder, when we say functional versus not, we mean how much friction are we putting in the way of tension? How much friction at the joint are we putting in front of tension at the muscle? Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And if we can remove that, then the rest of my workout, I can know with relative certainty that I've removed that friction, and then things that I'm optimizing for hypertrophy will be a clear representation of the load that I'm using to put torque on the muscle, not putting torque through the friction of the joint as I am limited to accessing some of that shoulder function as we defined it. Then my warm-up becomes, the process of warming up becomes only to serve the expression of frictionless movement through those exercises, right? So then all of my warm-ups aren't geared towards, warming up my lat or warming up my pec or warming up my delt or rotator cuff or any of that. All my warm-up serves to do is to put me in a position where I can start to express these movements that are giving me insight in the amount of friction in my joints, the amount of function of these joints. So warming up takes a bad rap because it's like, well, warming up doesn't improve hypertrophy. It's like, okay, you're looking at it too closely. If our goal is to express, like, hey, this is a frictionless, qualitative starting line and quantitative starting line to every upper body session I do. Now, if I look at a logbook of the machines and the cued exercises and the resistance profile stuff, and I make progress there, I know I'm making progress in the muscle and I'm not encumbered by friction or lack of function in the joints. So your warm-ups now have an end point to them. So now my warm-ups are nothing. My warm-ups are pull-ups and dips. Now, given some injuries I have, dips are usually something that need a bit of a preemptive warm-up. So I know I'm going to have to go in and do something to service my extension and internal rotation of my shoulder. So I'm going to do some sort of microcosm of that, but only so much as I can get into that position. I feel good. So I can walk in the gym on most days, feel pretty good, knock out 12, 15 pull-ups, body weight, probably the same, if not more dips. And I know I've reached the starting line. And it's such a good proxy for, is your session starting at the same place every single time? Now we can optimize for hypertrophy, but like you need to build this functional foundation, which if you took that clip out of context, you'd be like, man, this guy's just on some bullshit. But like, if you understand what I mean when I say that, you can actually start to contextualize, common practices in training that people find to do. So if you ask someone, if you went back into Golds back in the 70s when it was still on Rose Avenue, and you ask someone how they warm up, Schwarzenegger used to do 50 pull-ups before he started working out. And then he got into the rest of the stuff that he did. But it's like, they just didn't know how to explain it. So I think when we look at warm-ups, when we look at exercise selection, when we look at the importance of function and what it means from like a joint mechanic standpoint, then you can hopefully, for the love of fucking God, so we don't have to have this conversation again, you can hopefully start to build really efficient programming that is optimized for hypertrophy without solely optimizing for length tension. It's tough. You know how to speak fluent Jordan as a fellow Jordan, and also as someone who's dealt with me for over a decade now. Did that make sense?
I think so. I think it's a really accurate way of explaining it. And I really like the idea that people have been doing this. The people that have seen success, they've been doing this since the start. And it's been an intuitive process, but they just haven't been able to explain it. And I think you can even flip that and say the people that aren't doing this or are preaching anything other than this, they don't have the experience to understand, or they don't have the words to explain why this is important and why you need to go about training this way.
Yeah. So I think what we do next week is we run it back for lower body, because I think that, and again, you train for whatever your outcome is. But I think as a heuristic, the model, what I like about the exercise we went through today, because clearly based off the intro, we did not have a plan. But I'm really happy of where this landed. I think we could take this framework and run it back again for like lower body programming in general. And again, like when you pay attention to these things, I think one of the things that gets tripped up, to kind of backtrack on myself here, is the warm-up component. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And I think, let's use this as an analogy. People say that foam rolling doesn't work because for a long time they thought foam rolling, what they were trying to achieve was breaking up scar tissue. So, they started to have a better understanding of the tensile strength of scar tissue and realized quite quickly that couldn't have been happening. That couldn't have been the mechanism of correction. So people will say foam rolling doesn't work because when they say work, what they mean is foam rolling doesn't achieve the task of breaking up scar tissue. It's like, okay, but it's quite prominent everywhere. And we anecdotally get feedback on a daily basis that people like it. And so what does work mean? And when you drill, it's like that. It's like, oh, it doesn't break up scar tissue. It's like kind of the same thing with warm-ups and hypertrophy at large. And what's tricky about the model that we're proposing is that it's a fluid model, that it has performance milestones that when you eclipse, your model changes, right? When I can walk, like I'll walk to the gym 30 minutes and pull-ups are a good indicator for me. For me, it used to be, suffering from injuries, it used to be something like a windmill, and it used to be something like a bottoms under press. I progressed from those. If you've been listening for a long time, again, I don't want to claim some delusional shit, but I feel like we started doing bottom under press and windmills, and then everyone started talking shit on them. And I'm like, I feel like you're talking shit about me. But understand that in the context of, I've had both shoulders completely hit by a Suburban. I tore my pec, 2 separate shoulder injuries, pretty drastic. So for me, like those were mile markers on the way to pull-ups and dips and having the function, understanding and reinstating the mechanics at these joints that had been pretty severely structurally impacted. Now where I used to walk in, do a bottom under press and a windmill and be like, do I need to do some T-spine work? Do I need to do some rib cage work? Do I need to do some scapulothoracic work? My mile marker has moved. And it's all based on performance. Performance is a proxy. And whenever you see that came out of this fucking face hole, and we know. And we know when we see it who said it first. But if you want to keep saying it, and anyways, dude, I'm not in a good mood today. I don't know if you could tell, but it's like, look, yeah, it's you have to be first comfortable with the idea that, one of my favorite quotes of all time. It's in the second edition of the L1 manual. We talk about it in L2 a lot. That all models are wrong, but some are useful. It's one of my favorite quotes of all time. When you're building your model, you have to accept some fluidity in how that model changes over time, how your performance changes. Otherwise, you have a static model that gets you to the same place every single time. If you can accept that fluidity, I feel like every time I say that word, I want to shout out Thayer. Just feel like it's a Thayer word. If you accept the fluidity of the mile markers, the performance milestones within your model, and it becomes part, or your model becomes deliberately adaptive over time, that's when, the old adage of all models are wrong, some are useful. That's when you start having a useful model. Most people just have a model that just that is stagnant. Therefore, their progress is stagnant, and therefore you see it. So what I think we'll do next week is, we're going to take this, we'll minimize a little bit of the shit talking, and we'll maximize, this principle of like, hey, what is a warm up good for? What does function look like at the lower extremity? And how do those two things combined then put you in a position to optimize for hypertrophy?
Love it. Yeah. I just want to say, fuck ball sack, titties, cocksucker.
I'm confident at this point that no one's listening.
No,
and I'm also confident that if they are, they're really excited about it. So
yeah, for sure.
Thanks
for sticking around for that.
Thanks for sticking around. That was big.
Yeah.
It was like that Blink 182 song. Do you remember that song?
Oh God, yeah.
I forget what it's called. It was fucking 100 years ago. They're still touring.
Wild.
Good for them. Hey, make your money, dog. All right, we'll leave it at that. I'm almost remiss to do any sort of promotion after that, so we'll just save it. We'll run it back next week.